This new spot is a gold mine. We gotta move. Risky. Cops could be waiting. He's right. We need a plan. Trust me, it's easy money.
Before there was a myth, there was a moment. A moment in a courtroom in the early 1990s when a federal prosecutor stood before a jury and described an organization so disciplined, so ruthless, and so deeply embedded into the streets of South Jamaica, Queens, that law enforcement officials compared it not to a street gang, but to a corporation, a criminal corporation run with the precision of a military unit and the cruelty of a medieval empire. The man who built that empire was not some Hollywood caricature of a drug lord. He was a product of his environment, shaped by poverty, absence, and the violent arithmetic of survival. His name was Kenneth Supreme McGriff, and what he built in the shadow of the New York skyline became one of the most feared and most studied criminal organizations in American history. This is not a story that glorifies what he did. This is a story that demands you understand why it happened, how it happened, and what it cost. In blood, in time, in leaves swallowed whole by the concrete streets of Queens. To understand the Supreme Team, you must first understand South Jamaica, Queens. Not the Queens of today, with its gleaming commercial strips and gentrifying blocks, but the Queens of the late 1970s and early 1980s, a borough fractured by poverty, neglected by city government, and left to rot after the collapse of manufacturing jobs that had once sustained working-class black families. South Jamaica was a pressure cooker. Unemployment was catastrophic. Public housing projects like Baisley Park Houses and the 40 projects were overcrowded and underfunded. Schools were failing. Police were either absent or predatory. Young black men growing up in that environment were handed a very short menu of options. And for many of them, the streets offered the only consistent economy they had ever known. Into this world, Kenneth McGriff was born in 1960. And from the beginning, he absorbed every lesson the streets had to teach. McGriff was not an accident. He was an inevitability. By the time he was a teenager, he had already developed the two traits that would define his entire career: an extraordinary ability to organize people and a total willingness to use violence as a business tool. He was charismatic in the way that certain rare individuals are. People who walk into a room and immediately command attention without raising their voice. He understood hierarchy, loyalty, and consequence before most of his peers understood algebra. He moved through the early drug trade with a clarity of purpose that was almost unsettling. While others got high on their own supply, McGriff studied. While others spent their money on jewelry before they secured their corner, McGriff reinvested. While others ran loose, undisciplined operations, McGriff was building something that would eventually shock even the most seasoned federal investigators. The name Supreme came not as a boast, but as a recognition. On the streets of South Jamaica, you earned your name or it found you, and the name Supreme found Kenneth McGriff, because those around him recognized something in him that they couldn't fully articulate, but could feel in their bones. He was supreme in his thinking, supreme in his control, and supreme in his ambition. By the early 1980s, he had begun assembling what would become the Supreme Team, a crew that operated out of the Baisley Park and South Jamaica housing projects, and that would grow into one of the most organized drug trafficking organizations New York City had ever produced. The timing was not coincidental. The crack cocaine epidemic was beginning to detonate across urban America, and men like McGriff, who were already positioned in the drug trade, suddenly found themselves standing at the edge of a gold rush that would make everything that came before look like pocket change. Crack cocaine changed everything. That is not hyperbole. It is a documented sociological, economic, and criminal truth. When crack hit the streets of New York in the mid-1980s, it transformed the drug trade from a relatively modest underground economy into something that generated wealth on a scale that defied comprehension for young men who had grown up with nothing. A kilogram of powder cocaine could be converted into crack and sold for 2, 3, sometimes 4 times the original investment. The profit margins were staggering. The demand was almost bottomless. And for the Supreme Team, which already had the organizational infrastructure and the street credibility to control territory, the crack epidemic was the equivalent of striking oil in your backyard. McGriff and his team didn't just participate in the crack trade. They dominated it. At the height of their operation, the Supreme Team was generating an estimated $200,000 per day. Read that number again. $200,000 per day on the streets of Queens. But money on that scale does not come without violence, and the Supreme Team's relationship with violence was neither casual nor chaotic. It was systematic. McGriff understood something that many street organizations failed to grasp. Violence, used recklessly, is a liability, but violence applied strategically is a tool of corporate governance. He used it to protect territory, to discipline members who stepped out of line, to eliminate rivals before they could consolidate power, and to send messages that would ripple through entire communities. The Supreme Team was not simply a drug organization. It was a shadow government. In South Jamaica, there were people who feared them, people who respected them, and people who depended on them. The organization provided money to families, settled neighborhood disputes, and enforced a kind of brutal order that the actual government had long since abdicated. This is one of the most complicated and painful truths about organizations like the Supreme Team. In the vacuum created by poverty and abandonment, they filled a role that the state was supposed to fill. One of the most critical figures in the Supreme Team's early dominance was a man whose relationship with McGriff would define both of their destinies: Gerald Prince Miller. Prince was McGriff's nephew, and in many ways he was the operational engine of the Supreme Team, while McGriff was the architect. Where McGriff was strategic and composed, Prince was intense and hands-on. He was involved in the street-level operations in ways that McGriff, as the organization's leader, sometimes deliberately kept his distance from. Prince was feared on a visceral level, not just respected, but genuinely feared. The kind of fear that keeps neighborhoods silent and witnesses reluctant. The uncle-nephew dynamic at the top of the Supreme Team created a power structure that was both strong and, as would eventually be revealed, dangerously vulnerable to the resentments and ambitions that simmer inside any organization where power is concentrated at the top. By the mid-1980s, the Supreme Team's influence had extended far beyond a few housing project corridors. They had established distribution networks, controlled multiple drug spots across South Jamaica, and built a reputation that made them untouchable in the eyes of most local competitors. Their enforcers were known and feared. Their product was consistent. Their organization was disciplined enough that new members were vetted, ranked, and assigned specific roles: runners, lookouts, soldiers, lieutenants, in a structure that law enforcement would later describe in federal indictments with a kind of astonished respect. The NYPD had gangs. The Supreme Team had an org chart. It was during this period that the Supreme Team's story began to intersect with another name that would become legendary in New York's criminal history: Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols. Fat Cat operated out of the same South Jamaica ecosystem, and his organization, while separate from the Supreme Team, existed in an uneasy parallel relationship with McGriff's crew. The two organizations divided territory and sometimes collaborated, and their combined dominance over South Jamaica in the mid-1980s made the neighborhood what one federal prosecutor would later call a virtual open-air narcotics supermarket operating with impunity. The convergence of these two organizations in the same geographic space at the same historical moment with the same explosive product created a criminal ecology that law enforcement was completely unprepared to address. What law enforcement was also unprepared for was the level of corruption that organizations like the Supreme Team could generate around themselves. Money in quantities that defy imagination does something specific to institutional integrity. It finds the cracks. And in the NYPD of the 1980s, there were cracks. Officers who were poorly paid, who worked brutal hours in communities that despised them, who watched drug money flow in volumes that dwarfed their annual salaries. Some of them broke. Some of them took envelopes. Some of them provided information. Some of them looked the other way, at precisely the moments when looking was their only job. The Supreme Team's ability to navigate law enforcement was not simply about evasion. It was about penetration. They understood that the system had vulnerabilities, and they exploited them with the same cold intelligence they brought to every other aspect of their operation. But the federal government was paying attention, and the federal government had tools that local law enforcement did not. The Drug Enforcement Administration and the FBI had begun developing cases against major New York drug organizations in the early 1980s, and by the mid-decade, they were deploying RICO, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, as a weapon capable of dismantling entire criminal enterprises rather than just prosecuting individual crimes. RICO was a revolutionary legal instrument because it allowed prosecutors to charge an entire organization and its leadership for the collective criminal acts of its members, even when the leaders had carefully insulated themselves from direct participation in specific crimes. For organizations like the Supreme Team, which had operated with exactly that kind of insulation in mind, RICO was an existential threat. The first major blow to the Supreme Team came not from a federal indictment, but from an event that shook the entire city and accelerated law enforcement's focus on South Jamaica with unprecedented intensity. In February 1988, a 15-year-old boy named Darrell Littlejohn, no relation to the later criminal of the same name, was shot and killed in a case connected to the drug war swallowing South Jamaica. But the case that truly ignited public outrage and brought the full weight of federal attention to bear was the murder of police officer Edward Byrne. In January 1988, Officer Edward Byrne, a 22-year-old rookie, assigned to guard a witness in a drug case connected to Fat Cat Nichols's organization, was shot 5 times in the head while sitting in his patrol car. The brazen execution of a uniformed police officer on a Queens street was a declaration of war against the state, and the state responded accordingly. The Byrne murder did not directly involve the Supreme Team, but it was the political earthquake that cracked open the entire South Jamaica drug landscape for federal scrutiny. Everything was now on the table. Every organization, every name, every corner. McGriff's first federal reckoning came in 1987 and 1988, as investigators began building cases against the Supreme Team's leadership. In 1987, McGriff himself was convicted on drug charges and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He was 27 years old. For most organizations, the imprisonment of the founder would have been a death sentence. The operation would collapse, the members would scatter, rivals would move in. But the Supreme Team was not most organizations. McGriff had built something with genuine institutional resilience. Prince Miller stepped into operational control, and the organization not only survived, but in some respects grew more aggressive during the period of McGriff's incarceration. This was perhaps the most remarkable testament to the organizational architecture McGriff had built. It could function without him. Under Prince Miller's leadership in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Supreme Team continued to operate, but the character of the organization began to shift in ways that would ultimately accelerate its destruction. Without McGriff's moderating strategic intelligence at the top, The organization's use of violence became less calculated and more reactive. Murders were ordered with less deliberation. Internal disputes were resolved with bullets rather than with the kind of cold organizational logic that McGriff had practiced. The organization was still powerful, still feared, still generating enormous sums of money. But it was beginning to fray at the edges in ways that only became visible in retrospect. The federal government's RICO case against the Supreme Team was years in the making, built through the painstaking work of investigators who cultivated informants, recorded conversations, traced money flows, and documented murders. The investigation revealed not just the operational details of the Supreme Team's drug trade, but the full scope of their violence: murders, attempted murders, assaults, intimidation of witnesses, and corruption of public officials. The indictments that came down in the early 1990s were comprehensive and devastating. Prince Miller was charged with multiple counts, including murder and drug trafficking. Numerous other Supreme Team members faced federal prosecution. The organization that had seemed invincible was being systematically dismantled in courtrooms, where witnesses, some of them former members, told stories that the streets of South Jamaica had kept secret for years. McGriff's legal troubles in the 2000s, however, went far beyond the Murder, Inc.'s investigation. He was also implicated in an extraordinary series of crimes that seemed almost designed to confirm every fear that law enforcement had ever had about his post-prison activities. Most shocking was the allegation and eventual prosecution connected to a series of murders that prosecutors claimed McGriff had ordered in the mid-2000s, including accusations related to his alleged attempts to suppress a movie and television projects that he believed were defaming him. The specifics of these charges read like the plot of a crime novel. A drug kingpin, back on the streets after prison, allegedly ordering murders to control his own narrative. Tangled in the music industry, evading federal surveillance. The reality was grimmer and less cinematic than any fictional treatment could make it, because at the center of every allegation was human life extinguished. In 2007, Kenneth McGriff was convicted in federal court on murder conspiracy charges and drug trafficking charges, and sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He was 47 years old, was now permanently removed from the streets he had dominated for nearly 3 decades. The sentence was the final chapter of an operational life, but it was not, and will never be, the final chapter of the story, because stories like McGriff's do not end with a verdict. They echo. What the Supreme Team left behind in South Jamaica was not simply a void. They left behind a generation of young men who had grown up watching them, who had absorbed their aesthetics and their logic and their understanding of what power looked like and how it was maintained. They left behind a community that had been simultaneously victimized and protected by them, that had seen neighbors become millionaires and neighbors become corpses, that had learned to keep its mouth shut and its eyes open and its loyalties complicated. They left behind a mythology. The kind of mythology that grows in the absence of official history, that fills the space where textbooks never venture. The rap connection to the Supreme Team is not incidental. It is structural. Hip-hop emerged from the same New York streets, the same housing projects, the same poverty and creativity and rage that produced the Supreme Team, and the two phenomena were always aware of each other. Rappers name-checked McGriff and the Supreme Team not simply as a gangster flex, but as an acknowledgement of a shared origin story. 50 Cent, who grew up in South Jamaica, Queens, and whose early career was shaped directly by his proximity to the drug trade that McGriff had helped build, referenced the Supreme Team's world repeatedly in his music. The beef between 50 Cent and McGriff, which escalated to the point where McGriff was accused of financing attempts on 50 Cent's life, was one of the most bizarre and dangerous chapters in the already surreal history of hip-hop's relationship with street violence. That a rapper and a drug kingpin could find themselves in potentially lethal conflict over the art that emerged from the streets they both claim tells you everything about how completely those two worlds had collapsed into each other by the early 2000s. The federal prosecution of the Supreme Team also produced one of the most important legal legacies of any street organization in New York history. It served as a case study for law enforcement and prosecutors nationwide in how to build RICO cases against complex criminal organizations. The techniques developed to investigate and prosecute the Supreme Team, the use of informants, the meticulous documentation of organizational hierarchy, the tracing of financial flows, the patient accumulation of evidence over years became templates that were applied to drug organizations across the country. In a terrible irony, McGriff's organizational genius in building the Supreme Team taught the federal government how to destroy organizations exactly like the Supreme Team. The women of this story deserve acknowledgement because their presence is almost always written out of the histories that get told, even though their role in the Supreme Team's world was not peripheral. Women bore children with Supreme Team members and raised those children in households where their father might be dead or in prison before the child turned 5. Women managed households that were partially funded by drug money and lived under the constant threat of becoming collateral damage in conflicts they had no control over. Some women were active participants in the organization, holding drugs, holding money, holding information. All of them lived inside the reality that the Supreme Team created, and all of them paid a price for it that rarely appears in the indictments or the documentaries. The children of South Jamaica, who grew up during the Supreme Team era, carry that history in ways that are still being processed. Some of them watched fathers and uncles and brothers go to prison for life. Some of them lost family members to the violence that the drug trade generated. Some of them internalized the Supreme Team's aesthetic, the power, the money, the respect that came from controlling the streets, as the definition of success, because in the world they grew up in, it was the most vivid definition of success available. Some of them became the next generation of street organizations, and some of them got out, went to college, built careers, raised families, carrying inside them the complicated legacy of a neighborhood that was both their home and their wound. The federal government's war on the Supreme Team was in many ways a proxy for its war on crack cocaine. And that war, while it succeeded in dismantling specific organizations and imprisoning specific individuals, did nothing to address the conditions that made those organizations possible and necessary in the first place. South Jamaica is not a wealthy neighborhood today. The poverty that shaped Kenneth McGriff is still shaping young men in those same housing projects. The school-to-prison pipeline that consumed a generation of black men in the 1980s and 1990s is still operating. The absence of economic opportunity that made the drug trade look like the only viable economy has not been resolved by any federal prosecution. This is not an excuse for what the Supreme Team did. The violence they inflicted on their own community, the lives they destroyed, the families they shattered, cannot and should not be rationalized away by structural arguments. But it is a truth that any honest accounting of the Supreme Team's story must confront. The Supreme Team was a symptom of a disease that the criminal justice system is not equipped to cure. The legacy of the Supreme Team in American criminal history is one that researchers, prosecutors, sociologists, journalists, and community members are still negotiating. They were, by any objective measure, one of the most sophisticated and destructive criminal organizations that New York City produced in the 20th century. At their peak, they generated more revenue per day than most legitimate small businesses generate in a year. They maintained organizational discipline that law enforcement agencies struggled to match. They produced leaders of genuine strategic intelligence who happened to deploy that intelligence in the service of criminal enterprise. And they left behind a trail of dead bodies, broken families, and devastated communities that stretches across decades. But they also exist in the popular imagination as something more than simply criminals. And that complexity is worth sitting with, rather than dismissing, in communities that have been systematically excluded from legitimate paths to power and wealth. Men who seized power by other means occupy a complicated position. They are not heroes. That word is too simple and too clean for what they were. But they are not simply villains either, at least not in the way that the word villain is usually deployed to shut down thinking. They are products of a specific American failure, the failure to provide equal economic opportunity, equal education, equal justice, equal dignity, and they are also perpetrators of enormous harm. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the story of the Supreme Team cannot be told honestly without holding both of them at once. Kenneth Supreme McGriff will almost certainly die in federal prison. The streets of South Jamaica have moved on in the way that streets always move on. New organizations, new conflicts, new economies, new tragedies. In the genealogy of hip-hop culture, in the case files of the DEA and FBI, in the memories of everyone who lived through their reign. They were extraordinary, they were destructive. They were a mirror held up to the face of a society that did not want to look at what it saw reflected back.
We gotta move. Risky, cops could be waiting. He's right, we need a plan. Trust me, it's easy money.
Kings of Queens, baby. Yeah, drug kingpins.
Edward Byrne, 22 years old, was assigned to protect a witness whose house had been firebombed, a witness in a drug case. It was an execution, a message from the drug dealers that South Jamaica is ruled not by government, but out of the barrels of guns. Byrne's father Matthew is himself a retired police officer. He saw in his son's death a warning that anarchy is growing fast in America's neighborhoods.
For many years, we've all heard about the so-called war on drugs. The drug peddlers are now telling us that they've declared war on society, and you and I are society. And now the question becomes, what are the decent people of the world going to do as a result of his death?
That speech struck home with Americans across the country and with the politicians.
One thing was sure, citizens cannot stop the drug war. The drug war, down with drugs! Amen!
South Jamaica suddenly became good campaign material.
You read about the execution of Officer Edward Byrne. You've read about the drug-related violence that's turning sections of our cities into combat zones.
Friends, the streets of America do not belong to drug peddlers and crack gangs. They belong to us, and we're going to take them back.
But in South Jamaica, the rhetoric is drowned out by another reality.
Where'd the other guy go? He went around the corner.
For 2 years, the neighborhood has been the target of a special drug crackdown program ordered by the New York City Police Department. Murders here still rose by more than 30% last year, an increase blamed on crack.
This is a 357. Do a lot of damage. These bullets go right through the vest? Sure. These bullets go right through a police officer's vest.
On almost any corner, you can find business going on. Here's something changing hands. And here. And here in broad daylight, the boy goes to a hiding place, gets out his merchandise, hands something over to this man. And again here. And the teenage businessman counts a roll of bills. In South Jamaica, you don't have to be an adult to work in the drug trade. This corner market is right next to a school.
I'm afraid now. I always believed if I got off the LST in Normandy that I would survive. But here, you don't even know if you go out your door, you might get shot.
Aaron Dozier lives down the block from the schoolyard drug market. He's a World War II veteran and a retired postal worker.
Officer Byrne was killed right near here.
Yeah, about 4 blocks from here.
And what happened after that?
They set up a headquarters in the house that he was supposed to be guarding, and all the dope pushers moved over to this side of the street.
They just lifted up their...
Took up their equipment and walked right over here.
They must not be very...
by the school.
Have they harassed the kids on the block?
Sometimes, yes.
Try to hustle the drugs too?
Try to make the kids either be lookout for the police or have the kids selling it for them, actually. Because the kid can't get any time. So what can he do? He go, they have a kid make the deliveries.
Every time you hear this, what do you think? You've been in combat zones before. Do you ever think this is a combat zone too?
Yep. All night you can hear pistol shots, sirens.
There was a nurse shot not far from here.
My wife's, she worked with her. For 18 years, my wife worked with that nurse.
With the nurse who was killed. She was shot in a line of fire.
Yeah, according.